Shalom from Israel, I'm Ariel Ben Abraham. This week we start a new series of commentaries on the Hebrew Bible. This time we're going to reflect on the book of Psalms by King David. We have done so far commentaries on the Torah, the entire Torah, both in English and Spanish in this YouTube channel that you're watching. And also we started expansion of commentaries on the series about the Messianic consciousness in Jewish prophecy. We have expanding more in Spanish in the videos. We plan to do so in the future with the English, but this time we're going to start in English the book of Psalms. Let's talk about a little bit about this essential book in Judaism. It's a compilation of writings of King David regarding the relationship that we have with God based on the Jewish identity. In other words, everything that is in the book of Psalms is based on the Torah. This is essential to highlight because many religions they use the book of Psalms, they're essential in their beliefs, but they understand it in a different way. The way King David understood the book of Psalms was based on the Torah. He was Jewish. There was no other religions in the area, in the region at that time. So we have to understand the book of Psalms as an understanding of what the Torah means for us as Jews. This is very essential. That doesn't mean that the book of Psalms is not made for anybody. It is. But the essentials, the fundamentals of the content, the messages of this book are related to the Jewish identity as understood as the Torah, the Jewish Bible. This is essential. In other words, every commentary that we're going to do here, every reflection that we are about to do are based on this frame of thought, this frame of understanding, this frame of conception. Now, the oral tradition tells us that some of these psalms were not written by King David, which actually is said. It's like this is a song of the songs of Torah, for instance. This is a psalm from Moses, the man of God. In other words, King David is giving credit to the people who wrote them. But we understand the book of Psalms as one unity. Unity means, in this case, that whoever is quoted in the book of Psalms, either by King David or by somebody else, they belong to the same, as we said before, frame of thought. So the fact that King David didn't write some of them doesn't necessarily mean that the messages are different. They're exactly the same message with the same purpose, with the same intention, because they belong to the same unity. So we're talking about 150 chapters, some of them longer than others. But we're going to go one by one, and as long as, of course, we need to expand. And so we will take it from there. What other thing we should say about before we begin? Okay, the oral tradition also tells us that King David himself, when he was writing the Psalms, this book, he mentioned within the book of Psalms, and again by the oral tradition, that this book, this compilation of verses, of chapters, were inspired, this is very important, we're going to say, inspired by God. In other words, King David is not writing not Moses, not the sons of Korah, or whoever else is quoted as the creator of a particular psalm. All of it comes from God, as well as the remaining scriptures in the Hebrew Bible. Also, from the Torah to the last of the prophets' writings are the Word of God. So this is very important. So this is not King David's understanding or interpretation or feelings. Yes, some of them are related to his personal experience with God, of course. But again, we have to insist that every word of the Psalms, every word, is inspired by God. God made us speak. In this case, we're talking about God made us speak. We're talking about He inspired us to write or to praise Him. So the praising, that's actually the meaning of Psalms, the praising of God, is inspired by God, which makes sense, by the way. Because if we're praising God, God is the source of our inspiration to praise Him. So we can understand it that way. So our praise and our understanding of our praise comes from God. It sounds a little difficult to grasp because, hey, if I'm doing this, how come that God is speaking through me? But that's exactly what it is. So the idea here, the explanation of this, is that our praising represents not just our relationship with God, but our connection with Him. So once we are connected, then we can say that we are at the unison with God. Now, we're not saying, by no means, that, hey, while you get inspired, you become God. No, this is not what it means. We are at the unison, His will and our understanding and the understanding that He wants us to have, are one, are the same. I think that after this preamble, let's start understanding every reflection that we make here on this book as our relationship with God, and foremost of all, our connection with Him. So with this preamble, then we start. Verse 1, chapter 1 of the book of Psalms. Happy is the man that has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seat of the scornful. Happy is the man that has not walked in the counsel of the wicked. The book starts with a moral, ethical statement. I would say a premise to understand the rest of the book. So God is telling us through King David, you are happy as long as you live in goodness. Which makes sense, by the way. So you're happy because you're living the blessings of goodness. So the fact that he's saying all the way around, in other words, he's not, the book is not beginning telling exactly this. It's like, happy are those who live in goodness. No. He said, happy are those who has not walked in the way of the evil, of the wicked. So he said in the opposite way, in the negative way. To make us aware that the wicked ways, meaning the negative ways, meaning the non-goodness, is something that doesn't make us happy. And by happiness, we have to understand this happiness as the complete plenitude of fulfillment in goodness. So this is not a complete satisfaction in doing bad to somebody else. or to get happiness at the expense or detriment of others. So this is an essential premise to start the whole reflections on the book of Psalms. Happy is the man that has not walked in the counsel of the wicked. So we're not talking about walking with the wicked. No, we're talking about the counsel of the wicked, meaning the way of thinking, their feelings, their emotions, their intentions have not a positive purpose. Therefore, we have to celebrate not being in negative traits, qualities, and trends in consciousness. Which again, we have to repeat, makes perfect sense. So we're happy when we're in goodness. We're happy when we are not following evil ways. This, again, is an ethical and moral premise. And we will see that there's a clear division from the beginning between goodness and wickedness, good and evil. It's a clear distinction from the beginning. Why? This is the way God wants us to approach life, making distinctions. For the simple reason, we have referred this many times in our blog, in other commentaries, that in order to have free will, we need to tell the difference between one thing and the other. Otherwise, we don't have free will. So we need to have a clear understanding, a clear discernment about either or. Both of them, actually. And again, we have to insist in what we have said many times before in our blog and in the videos. We have to take wickedness, evil, and negative trends in consciousness as references to do the opposite, to choose the opposite, which is goodness. So let's understand darkness and everything with a negative connotation as references to choose the opposite. So this is an essential preamble. Nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seat of the scornful. So in other words, it was not just knowing the reference, it's like not being there. It's like it's an invitation, it's like from the beginning, choose good all the time. Don't go the other way. Don't go the opposite way. So it's like you have to celebrate the fact that you never had to be in a negative situation. Now, we may say, hey, we need to experience evil in order to choose good. Yeah, but at some point, if we are able to understand, we can see, meaning knowing the difference between one thing and the other, we don't have to try and experiment in order to know. There are some things that we can get with basic understanding. We know. Now, there are things that are easier to grasp than others. Obviously, if we are in a cliff, in front of us is a deep, deep cliff. We know. We don't need to jump in order to know that it's bad, that we're going to die. We know that. It's like our body knows. Don't get too close. We may fall and die. So we're seeing something. Now, of course, that's different than do not play with fire, or be careful when you light a fire because you may get burned. It's different. Because this fire is not going to kill us. We know that. So we will want to experiment being burned in order to avoid it. So we want the experience. We want to know what does it feel get burned. And again, the levels. We have said once that our sages in the Talmud, they talk about different levels of understanding, or person, or levels in consciousness, let's say. So like some people, for instance, they are told something, it's like, do not do this, do not do that, they just don't do it. They heard, they said, makes sense, if you say that it's bad, we shouldn't do it, they don't do it. The second is the one that are told, they understood, but they do it. They do the negative thing. And then they don't do it anymore. That's the second category. The third is the category that again and again and again. So it's like a disappointing in which they learn, and then the last category, the bottom one, the fourth one, is like no matter what, how many times they will do it over and over with non-stop. Become like an addictive state. So of course we all want to be in the first level. It's like, hey, we understood that we don't have to try anything, taste anything, experience anything. It's clear. We all don't have that level. So it's like those are the saints, the perfect people. So our Hasidic tradition, they say that the best way to do is to be in the middle. That's the ideal. Like you are not perfect, but you are not negative. Okay? You are not suffering from your decisions. So you have the level in which you have the reference all the time on your right and on your left. So you have to turn in the right direction. So let's continue. Verse 2. But his delight is the law of the Lord. And in this case, the law, literally in Hebrew, is Torah. So we're not talking about the law of God as something abstract. We're talking about the Torah. But his delight is in the Torah of the Lord. This is interesting because the Torah comes from God, but in this case, King David is saying it's the Torah of God. He says it's not the Torah. That's the one that he is his. And in his Torah, does he, this person, meditate day and night. Another one, heavy. By heavy, we're talking about fundamental premise to understand the rest of the Psalms and the rest, actually, of the whole Hebrew Bible. We have to be happy in the goodness. So now the second verse is telling us you have to be happy in the delight of the instruction. That's the meaning of Torah, by the way, in Hebrew, of God. You have to be happy. Now we're talking about that the Torah tells us it's the ethical teaching, instruction, that we have to live in goodness in order to be happy, in order to be fulfilled, in order to multiply, in order to expand, in order to grow, in order to be happy. So then we have to do that. And again, an absolute statement here, another one. And this person has to meditate on this instruction day and night. So it's not a part-time thing. It's like, oh, we're going to study Torah 8 hours a day, and then the other 8 hours I'm going to go somewhere else doing something different. The idea is to be focused in the goodness all the time. So let's make this simple, because you may say, well, you're talking about the Torah, it's a bunch of 613 mitzvot, commandments, and don't do this, don't do that. Let's not complicate things here. We're talking about the Torah, we're talking about the goodness God wants us to make prevail in the material world, in life. That's the whole point. And there's a way to define and to live and to experience goodness. Those are the commandments. That's the oral Torah. It's just telling us. So you want to be good, you want to love your neighbor as yourself, you just do it this way. So it's not our version, somebody else's version, another religion version, other people's version. It's the version. It's the Torah, it's the oral Torah. Explain us how. That has expanded for many centuries. We're going to say thousands of years. Yeah, it is eternal. So we have to understand it that way. So we have to meditate, in other words, keeping present this all the time. It's interesting because we say that with the Kiryat Shema. When we say Shema Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. The commandment is that you will keep this all the time. You will teach this when you wake up, when you lay down, and you will speak to this the whole day, to your children. And when you put it in your doorpost, it's like you're going to have it permanent, 24 hours, 7, 360 days a year. All the time you have to think about goodness. Keep that reference all the time. It's challenging, but that's the way it goes. There's no other way. We have to. If we want to be happy, if we want to delight in goodness. And I have news for you that probably you have read in the blog. The Messianic era, this final stage in God's creation for humankind, for this material world, is about permanent goodness as the premise, the prelude, the prerequisite to know God. To want to know God, then we have to start being good, living by goodness all the time, as our common bond with Him. God is our creator, God is good. King David will say that dozens of times in the book of Psalms. Odu Hashem ki tov ki olam hasdo. Be thankful to God because He's good. His loving kindness is endless, is eternal. We come from there. Therefore, we have to find out about our identity. From whom we come from. It's a compelling need to know from where we came from. And the Torah is telling us you come from a God that is good. Something that we didn't say in the preamble to start studying, and we will repeat this along the way, is that we have said this many times in the blog and in the videos. The person, this is of course your servant opinion. For me, this makes perfect sense. I mean, this is not like discovering the cold water or the hot water or anything like that. Which is that the man who best understood the Torah in all times and give us evidence of that is King David. Like you read the Psalms and you really you get immediately this guy really understands what the Torah means. Why he's telling you, he's telling us. What is it about? So this is Torah understanding what he's telling us here. He's not going to tell anything new. He's telling us what the Torah is telling, is teaching, in his own words, in his own understanding. Which, by the way, as you can see, is very deep. It's very deep. So every time that this friend of yours reads the psalm, is like, this guy really, really understood everything here. So let's approach the book of Psalms. We should have said this from the beginning, as we just said, in that way. We're learning from a man who really understood the depths of the Torah. And he's telling us. And actually, God is telling him, just tell the people how you understand it, because that's the way it is. And that's what we're doing here. So we said, but his delight is in the Torah of God, of the Lord, and in his Torah does he meditate day and night. So we have to study Torah. But what we do is studying Torah is not, as we said before, like, okay, we're going to do 2-3 hours, 1 hour, 20 minutes, whatever amount of Torah study. The idea is to keep thinking, meditating that all the time. And the easiest way to do is to keep goodness as a reference all the time. That would make it easier. So it's not like every day we have to remember every commandment, we have to keep it in mind, and just take the goodness. That's what it's about. And we know that. So verse 3, and he shall be like a tree planted by streams of water, that brings forth its fruit in its season, and whose leaf does not wither, and in whatsoever he does, he shall prosper. Again, we're talking about axioms. It's truths that are evident by themselves. To the moment we follow, goodness comes. And we have to prosper because it's evident, it's self-evident, that in goodness we prosper, we're happy. So we pursue happiness. Then we prosper, we expand, we multiply. We become abundant in our goodness, in goodness. So let's take a look again. And he shall be like a tree planted by a stream of water. It's interesting because throughout the Talmud, the oral Torah, a tree is a representation of the Torah. So people say in the Talmud that the tree of life in the Garden of Eden was the Torah. So there is no need to know anything else if we have the tree of life. So the Torah was good enough to eat from. So mystics say that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a tree to taste after being fed enough from the tree of life. So it was a process that was broken. So the idea was that Adam and Eve would learn as much as possible the Torah, feeding themselves from the tree of life in order to taste the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the idea is very simple, it's not complicated. We have to have a strong understanding, knowledge, experience of goodness, complete total goodness, in order to approach something different. And this is exactly what we had to learn throughout the centuries, throughout these thousands of years. We had to learn from goodness in order to face and defeat evil. So we have done it, we still doing it in the hard way, just all the way around. So we need to suffer the lack, the negative traits and trends in consciousness, egos, fantasies, and illusions, in order to recognize what goodness is. So in that way, we understand that everything negative ultimately serves a positive purpose. Why? Because we learn from it. It's not that we get stuck in it. We cannot move and we die. The idea is like, hey, I'm in this negative situation, I'm suffering, but I'm going to get out of here. And eventually we will. Sooner or later. So, it's a tree that is planted with streams of water. Also, another allegory of the Torah is water. So we have two references here, the tree and the water. And it's interesting because they serve a dynamic process. The tree needs the water in order to live and fructify and blossom. So in this case, the person is the tree. The person is life. And this life has to be nurtured by the waters of goodness. The waters of Torah. Because if it's not the way, then it's not going to grow and eventually it's going to die. And we know that too. So these allegories of King David are very, very fundamental to understand the moral principle that we were mentioned before. That this is pretty much about making a clear difference between goodness and wickedness. That brings forth his fruit in its season. So there's a time here, there's a timing that we have to take into consideration. So it's like, okay, the tree is getting water, it's being fed, so what? He said, well, some time will pass in order for this tree to bear fruit. And it will, in its season. So there's a time for everything. Some trees takes longer than others. Some trees are blossoming and producing fruit all the time. It's interesting. We have to mention this because it's true. In the house of a close relative of mine in Colombia, they have a guava. It's called guayaba in Spanish, a guava tree. That tree is producing fruit every day. I'm sure. I'm not lying to you. Every single day. So it's a blessing. Because some trees have to wait, once a year, twice a year, or usually once a year. But this tree is producing guavas all the time. And they're sweet, by the way. So some guava trees produce all year long. But in this case, King David is telling us in its season. So it could be an immediate day, or it could be in its season. In 2 years, in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, we don't know. So, and whose leaf does not wither. Talking about leaves as part of our life. It's like our bodies is part of the tree. Don't rotten. So we're healthy all the time. There's no decay in this learning. In this goodness, there's no decay. Will never be decay in goodness. No matter how much we age physically. But you get the idea. And in whatsoever he does, he shall prosper. Of course, if we have this reference of goodness all the time, only goodness will come. It's just a simple matter of cause and effect. So let's keep this in mind. Verse 4, not so the wicked, but they are like the chaff which the wind drives away. It's comparing, this is interesting, it's comparing wickedness, evil, darkness, negative traits and trends in consciousness as chaff that is swept away by the wind. It's like it's untranscending. That's the meaning of it, the deeper meaning of it. The negative things do not transcend. They're destined to disappear. They're temporary. What remains is goodness. And we know that. Love is what remains. So let's pay attention to that. This is an important, amazing, fundamental preamble, this chapter 1 of the Psalms, to get the whole thing. And it's pure Torah what the King David is telling us here. It's pure Torah. This is not his thought, this is not his reflections, it's clear. So let's be aware of that. It's like, let's try to get into the transcending aspects of consciousness. Love's ways and attributes, goodness, expansion, abundance, not the opposite, not lack, not restriction, not constriction, not suffering, not pain. It's exactly the opposite. So we have to strive for what transcends in consciousness, and that is goodness. Because we come from the goodness of God that is transcendental. And we know that too. So folks, this is not something that we don't know. Everything that is written here, we know that. But the idea is to really anchor it in our consciousness. And I start living it daily, every moment. It's like we have a negative, the chance to have a negative reaction, stop. Is it worth it? And then make the choice. And be careful and be aware of the addiction, because sometimes we get aware of being angry, frustrated. Disappointments. We have so many that we get addicted to them. It's impossible to see something good because we have to turn it down in order to make it disappointing. Why? Because we're addicted to disappointments. We're addicted to frustration. We're addicted to anger. We're addicted to depression. So, let's think about that. Especially in our immediate surroundings. In other words, if we go to the post office, to the bank, and we have problems, and we have to in some way to get angry, to reject a negative situation. It's a negative reaction to a negative situation. So be it. But in our immediate reality, when we are alone and we are with people that matter to us, family, for instance, friends, let's switch. It's like, yeah, you come in with a negative approach, but you know what? Let's turn it around. Let's be happy. We love each other. Then let's act accordingly. And we do that through communication, to getting an understanding, a common understanding about this common bond that we have with them, which is love. Is that no matter what, love must prevail. Love must transcend. That's the idea. So, verse 5. Therefore the wicked shall not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Again, there's a blunt difference between the two things. The two choices, this dual approach, understanding of reality, this dual reference to choose and to do. So in other words, the whole idea is like everything that we have said in the previous verses of this first chapter of the Psalms is to establish the distinction between useless, productive, necessary, unnecessary, true, false, correct, incorrect, straight and bent, freedom and slavery. So, therefore the wicked shall not stand in judgment. In the judgment, no sin. In other words, as long as we choose goodness, goodness would be our judge. As long as we live in wickedness, wickedness will be the judge. It's interesting because in Judaism, we haven't mentioned this many times. It's interesting to remark. The so-called devil from other religions. In Judaism, the oral tradition admits that there's such a person, such a character, so to speak, but whose function is exactly what we're talking about here. It's not to make us sin. So, some understand it that way. He pushes us to sin and that kind of thing. It's another opinion. But the idea is to test us and to accuse us. It's the accuser. So there are two main definitions of this character. The antagonist, the one who opposes us, meaning opposes goodness in us, and second, the prosecutor. It's judgment. It's the one who's going to say, this guy did this and that. I came to bring it to you, so you got judge him. Or impose a sentence in this case. So that's the way we understand it. Therefore, the wicked shall not stand in the judgment, no sinners in the congregation of the righteous. So it will be a clear distinction that evil people live in their own ways and die by their own ways. And good people will live in good ways and die in good ways, if at some point they have to die. So this is interesting because they say that wicked implies judgment. This is the way we understand that sin is the punishment itself. So there's a judgment coming with the sin, with the negative action, with the negative thinking, with the negative speech, with the negative action. That's the judgment. It's the consequence, actually. So it's not necessarily I'm going to be punished because I've been bad. No. It's the direct consequence of my negative actions. That's the judgment. And it comes to me. Why? Because I did it. Nobody else did. I did it, so I have to get it. Now, in the kind of society that we have, if we violate a rule, meaning something, in other words, like it would be the equivalent of committing a sin, then we have to be judged. We have to be brought to justice, prosecuted, and eventually we are condemned. We get a sentence, a punishment, for us not to do it again. But we have the chance to, before we go to trial, to learn from our own understanding. Like, hey, this has consequences. Therefore, I have to be careful. So the sinners cannot sit in the congregation of the righteous. It's like, we are not part of that. So this is consonant with the first verse. Happy is that who didn't follow the counsel of the wicked. It's separate from that. It's a clear separation. All this preamble, we wanted to do it from the beginning, but it's better to do it now. It's to tell us and be aware and try to understand it in the right way, which is common sense, by the way. This is pretty much black and white. It is. It's either or. There's no gray here. And King David is telling us that, making echo of the Torah. The Torah is telling us the same. So King David is putting this to us in a clear way that we can understand it in a practical way. He says, don't hang out with bad people. Just don't. Don't sit with them. Don't be in their ways. You're sitting on judgment. That's the idea. final verse of the first chapter, which is verse 6. Because God regards the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked shall perish. It's interesting. You could have said God likes the ways of the righteous, but he doesn't like the way of the wicked. He doesn't say it that way. He phrases it in a different way. He says he regards, like he appreciates, gives credit, is happy with, is pleased with the way of the righteous. But the way of the wicked shall perish. It's like the way of the wicked, as we said before, another way that he's saying, King David is saying, is telling us, is that, or what he said before, is chaff, is temporary. Wicked does not transcend, shall perish. And this is a messianic statement, by the way. This had to do with the messianic era. It's decreed by God in the Torah, by the way. This is something that will happen. Wickedness will be wiped out from the face of the earth. It will be. There will be no evil. The way of the wicked shall perish. Will. She's telling us, why wasting time living in the way of the wicked if you don't go beyond that? You get stuck in there. Doesn't transcend, it's temporary. So God regards going forward. That's the righteous way. Righteousness is goodness. It's choosing goodness. What is right, what is good is right. Yeah, never said anywhere, evil is right. No, goodness is right. The whole purpose of justice is to make goodness prevail. That's the whole point. So when we are sitting judgment, we have to learn that our ways are not the ways to transcend. That we have to change them. We have to go to the other side. We have to go to the white side, the right side, the righteous way. So it's a clear, as we said from the beginning, it's a moral, ethical statement, clear to understand the rest. And to understand the Torah, to understand life, to understand Judaism, everything. Okay. So with this we find this first chapter. We will continue as possible, depending, as we said before, on the length of the chapters. If the chapters are too long, we either are going to do two things. We summarize, which we try not to. Why? Because every verse is meaningful. So we have to go accordingly. So for example, chapter 2 has 12, double amount of verses. So we'll try to cover in the next week the second chapter, all of it, as much as we can expand on. So we hope that this expanding, these reflections of King David, trying to understanding in our own consciousness in these times, and again as a prelude, as a premise to enter the Messianic consciousness that we want now. We don't want to wait anymore. And again, we have to insist that the Messianic consciousness is an individual and a collective promise. So let's start with us individually. We don't have to wait until the rest of the people wake up. We don't have to do that. We start doing our own awakening now. And that's why we're inviting everyone to partake in this. So we start our own individual awakening to goodness and make goodness prevail in every aspect, level, and dimension of consciousness, just for the sake of goodness. as the entrance, as the beginning of knowing God. Okay, so we wish you an amazingly, abundantly blessed week. Have an equally blessed Shabbat Shalom. And until next week.